The envelope was already open when I walked through the door. I noticed it on the kitchen counter. My name in Diane's handwriting. The flap torn back in that hurried way she had when she was excited about something. I almost picked it up. Instead, I stood in the hallway and listened, because Diane and her sister were at the dining table, and they were talking about me. "Mara's just so much to manage," Diane said. Her voice had that particular flatness she used when she wasn't actually complaining, when she was simply stating facts about the furniture. If she ever got her own place, I'd have room to breathe again. There was a small pause. Then her sister Renata said something about certain people never really growing up, never quite cutting the cord. And then Diane laughed and said, "She won't go. She's too dependent on us." I was holding a bottle of wine. I had stopped at the shop on the way home because Diane had mentioned the week had been exhausting. I had taken a half day off work for this, to come home early to help to make things easier. I set the bottle down quietly on the hallway table. Then I walked back outside, got in my car and sat there for a long time looking at the house we shared. The same house where I covered 2 months of mortgage while Diane's consulting work dried up during the renovation. The same house where I had turned down a relocation offer. Better salary, different city, because leaving felt impossible at the time. I had told myself it was about stability. That night I understood what it had actually been about. I drove back at the usual hour. Diane asked if I was tired. I said a little. She reminded me to pay the internet bill. I paid it. I did not bring up what I had heard. What I did instead was get very organized, very quietly. Over the following 10 days, I separated my financial life from hers with the kind of thoroughness I usually reserved for work. I am a healthcare contract administrator. I spend my days tracking what has been promised, what is owed, and what the documentation actually says, as opposed to what someone remembers agreeing to. I applied those skills to my own situation with the same detachment. New accounts. Redirected direct deposit. I stopped restocking the pantry without announcing it. When Diane noticed the refrigerator seemed lighter, I mentioned grocery prices. She agreed that everything had gotten expensive. I stopped driving her elderly mother to her twice-weekly appointments. I said my schedule had shifted. Diane arranged for a car service. She complained about the cost but did not connect the two things. A furnished rental in the eastern part of the city came available. Older building, good bones, a landlord named Felix, who said the tenants tended to stay because the neighborhood was quiet. Quiet was exactly what I needed. I signed on a Thursday. I moved the following Tuesday while Diane was at client meetings. 3 hours, a rented van, everything that was mine and nothing that was hers. I left my key on the kitchen counter. No letter. If I was too much to manage, the most efficient thing was to stop being present to be managed. The first month passed slowly, then all at once. Nobody called. The silence had a texture to it, not loneliness exactly, but the strange weightlessness of not being needed. The second week, Diane sent a text, "Coming home tonight." I left it unread. The third week, a single missed call. By the end of the month there were 7 missed calls and a handful of messages asking whether I was upset about something. Then on a gray Wednesday morning, I received a voicemail from Renata. Renata, who had been at that table. Who had made the comment about people who never cut the cord. Her voice was careful, a little confused. She said that Diane had only just realized my room was empty. She had apparently assumed I was spending time with a colleague. But the real issue, Renata said, was that an automated payment Diane had been drawing from our shared account had failed. Several times. She wanted to know what was happening. I played the message 4 times. Diane had not noticed I was gone. She had noticed the money was gone. I went to work. I sat in 3 meetings. I answered emails about contract renewals and compliance audits. Outwardly, I was the same person I had been for years, precise, reliable, unobtrusive. Inwardly, something that had been off balance for a long time was finally settling level. That evening my phone lit up continuously. Diane first, then Renata, then Diane again. The messages escalated in a very specific way, Initial concern, then logistics, then something that looked like worry but was structured entirely around access. Why isn't the account active? Are you safe? We've been trying to reach you. The safety concern arrived in the same message as the account question, separated by a single line break. I made dinner in my small kitchen. I remember thinking that the apartment, which I had initially found cramped, felt unexpectedly spacious. It held exactly what I needed, and nothing I had agreed to carry for someone else. The next morning brought 12 missed calls. Around noon, my manager stopped at my desk and told me there were 2 visitors asking for me. I recognized them immediately through the glass of the conference room, Diane with her handbag clutched in her lap, and beside her, I went in and closed the door. Diane stood immediately. Why would you do this? Do you have any idea how worried we've been? The worry was present but thin. Beneath it was something more structural. What specifically are you worried about? I asked. She paused. Her husband spoke instead. The joint account is disconnected. The transfer didn't go through. There it was. I moved out, I said. Diane made a small sound, almost dismissive. No, you didn't. I did. The silence that followed had weight. I watched Diane try several framings. It was an overreaction. It was unlike me. Families didn't simply disappear. I waited until she finished, and then I said, "You told Renata you'd finally be able to breathe if I got my own place." Her face changed. Her husband's eyes moved to her. "You were listening," she said. "I came home to surprise you." That was taken out of context. I asked what the context was. Neither of them answered. My manager knocked gently on the glass. I told them I had to get back to work. Diane grabbed my arm as I turned. "You can't just withdraw like this. We depend on you." The word depend landed with a particular clarity, given everything. I told her I wasn't coming back. Her husband said if I wanted to manage on my own, that was my choice, but not to expect rescue when things fell apart. I said nothing. They left. That night there were more messages. Long ones from Diane about how hurt she was. Short, pointed ones from her husband about obligations. One of them included the phrase, "You can't walk away from the people who matter to you." I almost replied. I made tea instead. 2 days later, I called Renata. She answered immediately, relieved and cautious at the same time. I told her what I had heard at the table. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I didn't realize you were home." "I know," I told her. She sighed. Then she said there was something I needed to understand about the shared account, that it wasn't only a convenience arrangement. Diane's husband had added me as a co-signer on a line of credit the previous year when their joint application came back insufficient. I had signed paperwork. I had believed, because I was told, that it was a routine update. I pulled up the documents that night. The language was not ambiguous. I was not a helpful addition to their financial household. I was collateral. That explained the panic. Not concern for me, concern about what my absence meant for the structure I had been quietly holding in place. I called her husband. I asked why he hadn't told me what I had actually signed. He said it was temporary. I said the documents didn't reflect that. He said I was overcomplicating a family matter. I said that if it were simply a family matter, it would not require my credit. He told me that without some arrangement they would face serious consequences. He said it the way a person states a weather forecast, matter of fact, as though my response to the information were the only variable still in question. I hung up. Then I requested the full account documentation from the financial institution. 2 days after that, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. A representative from the bank. She explained in a measured tone that the account had been flagged for multiple missed payments, payments that had been overdue before I removed my access. The problem had not started when I left. The problem had already existed. I had been the thing standing between them and its visibility. I thanked her, ended the call, and then sat for a long time without moving. The following week, I spoke with a contracts lawyer. I explained the circumstances under which I had signed, the framing, the absence of disclosure, the misrepresentation of what the agreement actually was. She told me there were remedies. Not simple ones, but real ones. The formal proceedings moved with bureaucratic indifference to everyone's feelings. What mattered was the documentation. What mattered was what the paperwork actually said. Several months later, Diane called at an hour she knew I might actually answer. She wasn't making a demand. She was crying. They were losing the property. She said, for the first time with nothing attached to it, that they had treated me badly. That she had said things she didn't mean, and had let me carry things she should have carried herself. That she was sorry. The apology was real. I could hear the difference. By then I had already signed a lease in a different city. A new position found through a former colleague, better work, cleaner terms. I signed it the same week the formal notice went out on their property. Timing, as it turns out, is indifferent to narrative. I didn't tell her about the new city immediately. There didn't seem to be a reason to frame it as departure when it was simply a beginning. I think about what she said sometimes, that she had let me carry things she should have carried. I believe she meant it. I also know that the version of me who would have stayed, who would have quietly covered the deficit and swallowed the comments and let the years accumulate into an arrangement nobody had agreed to out loud, that version of me is no longer available. She wanted breathing room. It turned out we both needed it. What I've come to understand is that usefulness, when it becomes the unspoken price of belonging, is not love. It's a contract nobody signs. And the moment you stop performing it, you discover what the relationship was actually made of. So I'll leave you with something worth sitting with. If the people closest to you suddenly had nothing to gain from your presence,